Hello and welcome back to The Note. Let's take aim at a couple of market verities. First of all, we all assume that deflation is a very alarming thing. That is why central banks the world over, particularly including the Federal Reserve here in the USA, have been devoting their energies to fighting deflation. Secondly, negative interest rates, or particularly negative nominal interest rates, are a matter of great concern, whether they are set directly by central banks or whether they are set by markets in the form of negative bond yields. Both issues that have greatly worried many people of late, both issues where, according to my guest today, that concern is wholly misplaced. He's the chief economist of HCWE, David Ranson. David, thanks very much for joining me once more.
Thank you.
Now let's start with the case for negative rates. Plainly, we've seen quite a market scare over the last month or two, particularly following the Bank of Japan's decision to adopt negative rates in January. Also much worry about negative bond yields in many European countries over the last year. Why would negative rates actually be healthy?
Well, negative rates can mean rates that are negative in the markets, so that government bonds sell above par, or you can have a policy rate which is negative, so that's the NIRP.
Right.
And these have to be analysed separately.
Okay, let's start with NIRP. Yeah.
And NIRP is really a tax on banks, because the central bank forces the banking system to hold all of these reserves that are really not needed, and then if they have to lodge those reserves at the central bank, then with a negative rate, it's basically taxing them for every dollar that they lodge.
Okay, so in the case of the Bank of Japan deciding to go to negative rates and sparking a very sharp fall in the shares in banks, that, in your opinion, does make sense?
Yes, it makes
sense. A sensible reaction to a tax on banks?
Yes. It makes it harder for banks to operate and do their job.
Now, many people are very nervous about the fact that you have negative nominal rates on German bunds, on Swiss government bonds and so on. That you're less concerned about.
Yes, that's quite different. If you have an atmosphere or an environment of falling prices, which is rare historically, but rather prevalent in the last few years, it's quite logical for falling prices, a negative rate of inflation, especially if it's an expected negative rate of inflation, to be associated with a negative interest rate.
Right.
It's quite natural.
Now, does that have negative economic consequences? I mean, let's take, for example, Switzerland, which I think is the one that the major economy that's been in negative rates for the longest.
Yes, I think there have been a lot of naysayers about Switzerland. They thought the things that the Swiss have done would throw the economy into some kind of depression, but Switzerland is doing really quite well. I'm not following it all the time, but I think it's doing better than the European Union is.
Even though it's in persistent deflation?
And it's persistent deflation and persistent negative rates in markets and in some respects. Of course, consumers who place deposits at banks, not even in Switzerland are they getting negative rates yet. But there is some discussion that could happen in the future.
Now, this is all contingent, just to be clear about this, on there being a deflationary backdrop.
Oh yes, if inflation is very high and positive, then you have to have high rates, and that's also perfectly natural, because what we want to have is a natural real rate. And the idea that you can manipulate or push the real rate around so as to improve the economy, I think is a very unfounded but very widely believed axiom of today's discussion of monetary policy.
But when it comes to deflation, which Ben Bernanke very, very clearly made it clear that it was his mission to fight deflation, your argument would be that deflation is actually positive, as I understand it.
Yes, the evidence is really overwhelming. If you look at a lot of countries going back 100, 200 years, there's quite a lot of evidence cumulatively, not much of which is modern, and deflation is followed consistently, even in Japan, by superior economic and stock market performance. It's just a question of what the data show, and it goes completely against all the doctrines.
Okay, that's very encouraging, even if it implies that a lot of people are wrong. However, it's all contingent on the notion that we are in a deflationary environment. How confident are you here in the US that we are in a deflationary environment? There have been a number of changes in market signals on this in the last matter of months.
If you'd asked me that 3 months ago, I'd have said very confident, because we'd had falling prices in the most liquid, transparent markets that we have, which are commodity markets, for several years already in the dollar market. But just in the last 2, maybe 3 months, it's turned, and we don't know if this is a permanent turn, but it's a turn in the other direction.
Which markets are you particularly looking at?
Commodity markets have been going up, gold particularly. Gold is the forerunner of all the other commodity markets, the one that moves first, and of course gold is up since late in December.
Okay, and on your schema, your way of looking at these things, plainly higher inflation if it's not clear enough yet that we're truly into an upward inflationary cycle, but if that does prove to be the case, that is problematic for the economy.
Yes, I think everywhere in the world, inflation is followed by weak economic performance and weak stock market performance, and there's no reason to think that it's going to change anytime soon. But again, it goes against a lot of doctrines. If people believe the doctrines, they don't go to the trouble of assembling the facts, which are really dogmatic on this.
Okay, David, thank you very, very much indeed.
Thank you.
David is always reliably, gloriously contrarian and always reliably, gloriously led by the facts. Plain the good news is perhaps we don't need to be so worried about negative rates and deflation as many people have been. The bad news is that there are growing risks of what would be a problem, which would be inflation here in the US.